By the time I approached my manager with the maternity leave adjustment request, I had already mapped out every contingency, workload handoff, and communication protocol in detail. I wasn't asking to be absent. I was asking to stay connected, to continue supporting the clients I had grown from cold accounts into flagship partnerships, even if it meant working remotely at reduced hours for just a few weeks postpartum. My role wasn't easy to fill overnight. I handled high-pressure accounts that required nuance, fast thinking, and long-term relationship trust. Everyone knew that. Still, the response came back cold, packaged in corporate courtesy. We support you taking the time you need, but remote work during leave creates operational ambiguity. For consistency, we'll move forward with full leave only. I was stunned. Not angry, yet, but stunned. I had watched other managers work from villas in Spain, from conferences abroad, from their in-laws' homes over holidays. But postpartum flexibility, that was somehow operational ambiguity. No negotiation, no acknowledgement of the structure I had proposed, just a forced binary, disappear or return. I chose to disappear. I didn't protest the decision publicly. I didn't ask for accommodations again. I signed the leave papers, submitted my out-of-office strategy, and stepped back as requested. But even before I left, I began noticing small shifts. My name quietly disappeared from the lead strategist column in our shared CRM. Two junior associates, bright, eager, but inexperienced, were added to my largest accounts without notice. Clients weren't informed, no formal introductions, no transition emails. Just a silent switch, as if the relationships I'd cultivated were transactional enough to be passed along without friction. In our final team meeting before my leave, the head of client services skipped my name and project updates. When someone mentioned my schedule, the conversation moved quickly past it. My presence had already been reduced before I'd even logged out. And in that moment, I realized something that would shape everything that followed. I wasn't being covered, I was being replaced. I kept my departure quiet, not because I lacked the words, but because I knew no one was really listening. My final week passed without acknowledgement. No company-wide message, no thank you for your contributions, not even a Slack emoji under my farewell handoff. I watched as the team moved forward like I had already been gone. There was no malice, just omission. And sometimes, omission is more revealing than direct insult. Before signing off, I made sure everything I left behind was clean, accurate, and easy to follow. My client files were annotated. Campaign timelines were outlined. I even included brand tone guides for each of the 3 largest accounts. Documents I had authored over the course of years, rooted in subtle understandings I had gathered through hundreds of client conversations. I didn't do it for them. I did it because I respected the work. Because I wasn't walking away from chaos. I was walking away from a system that chose convenience over people. The silence around my exit spoke loudly in its indifference. But what stood out even more was how unprepared they seemed to be for what was coming. In the final handover meeting, the new account leads asked questions I hadn't anticipated. Basic things, like which tools the client used for approvals, or whether a particular stakeholder preferred decks or summaries. One even asked, "Wait, what does this client actually do again?" I answered everything calmly. I wanted no excuses attached to my absence. But when I logged out that evening, for the first time in months, I felt no guilt. I hadn't left a gap, they had created it. They had chosen to disregard not just my flexibility, but the value I brought when present. And in doing so, they had convinced themselves that coverage was a matter of task lists and calendar invites. But what they never understood, what they had refused to learn, was that real continuity lives in relationships, in earned trust, in context no spreadsheet can capture, and all of that had just walked out the door. In the first few weeks of my leave, I tried to disconnect, not because I wanted to, but because I was supposed to. I had followed their rules, accepted the structure they offered, and stepped back from everything I had once been responsible for. But detachment doesn't happen on command, not when you've poured years into relationships, systems, and outcomes that carry your fingerprint. I didn't hover over my inbox or message my replacements. I had no intention of interfering, but I kept my eyes open. I checked our clients' social pages occasionally, not obsessively, just enough to see the edges. And almost immediately, I noticed things shifting. At first, it was small, a mismatched visual here, an off-brand caption there. Then came a full client campaign rollout that I had initially mapped out months earlier, now published with altered messaging. one that clashed entirely with the cultural nuance we had carefully designed it around. I remembered the hours I'd spent explaining to the client why tone mattered more than trend. That entire framework had been discarded, and the result was visible. Comments rolled in, questioning the intention of the message. A few polite, a few not. The brand manager stayed silent. I knew why. She wasn't consulted. I didn't say anything, not to the agency, not to the client. I wasn't there anymore, not officially, and that meant I had no voice in their world now. But it didn't mean I wasn't watching. I started keeping a quiet record. I had no plans to use it. No lawsuit, no complaint. I just wanted to understand something for myself. How much of my work had ever been seen as essential, and how much had they assumed could be automated, split, or reassigned without consequence? I began to see the full picture form. The two junior associates assigned to my accounts had taken over completely, but they weren't just overwhelmed, they were unsupported. Their names started appearing in campaign briefs I once reviewed. Their timestamps showed late nights and missed revision windows. One campaign was delayed. Another launched with a typo in the client's name, a client we'd worked with for 4 years. I didn't laugh. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired because I knew what they were learning, that some roles hold more than deliverables. They hold context, trust, subtle memory. You can't see those things in a project management tool. And once they're gone, they don't come back through delegation. Meanwhile, I took note of every public-facing stumble, every signal that they didn't know the client as well as they thought, and most importantly, every decision they made to pretend things were still under control. I wasn't documenting to expose anyone. I was documenting because it helped me stay rooted in the truth. They hadn't said I was unworthy. They'd said I was replaceable. And now, the evidence was making its own case, quietly, one misstep at a time. I never set out to prove them wrong. That would have required confrontation, and I had already been denied the space for honest conversation. What I wanted, quietly and perhaps selfishly, was confirmation. That the thing I'd sensed in every leadership meeting, in every HR brush-off, in every carefully worded denial, wasn't just in my head. That it had never been about capacity or coverage. It had always been about control. So I did what they hadn't expected. I gave them exactly what they asked for. Absence. No interruptions, no calls for correction, no hints sent through mutual connections. I let the machine run without me. And the more it ran, the more it faltered. Not because I had withheld anything, but because they had never understood what I had actually provided. Trust, timing, and texture. The kind of brand intuition that only exists when you've lived inside a client's voice long enough to anticipate their hesitation before they speak it. I had spent years learning that, and they had handed it off like a to-do list. While campaigns rolled out awkwardly and timelines slipped, I kept gathering. I took screenshots, saved public posts, marked dates when errors were published or clients went quiet. I mapped them against the timelines I had built and shared before I left, and I saw the distance widening between their imagined control and the actual unraveling taking place. One of the most revealing moments came when I received an email, accidentally. It was a reply in a campaign thread I had once been looped in on. The new lead had forgotten to remove my name. The message was brief but clear. "We're still trying to get clarity on this client's voice. She didn't leave much documentation." That line stayed with me, not because it was unfair, but because it proved everything I had been watching unfold. I had left them playbooks, timelines, full decks, annotated briefs. But what I couldn't leave behind, what no one ever can, was instinct. That wasn't something they could inherit. That had to be earned, and they never saw it. They had assumed that once I stepped away, the work would simply continue, uninterrupted. That output and outcomes were interchangeable, but they weren't. And each week that passed made that truth harder for them to ignore. Still, I remained silent, not detached, not indifferent, just patient. Because sometimes letting the structure reveal itself is more powerful than any attempt to tear it down. And what I was witnessing, day by day, misstep by misstep, was not sabotage. It was consequence. It didn't take long before the cracks became visible from the outside. A client I had once worked with closely, one of the agency's longest-standing partnerships, released a brand video that felt disjointed, like it had been written by someone who had only skimmed their mission statement. The copy was stiff, the visual tone oddly mismatched. I watched as the comments rolled in, some confused, some critical, and then, as I refreshed the post a few days later, it was gone, deleted without explanation. On the surface, it looked like a content misfire. Internally, I could imagine the panic. That campaign had been scheduled to anchor their Q2 launch. I had built the original structure, aligned it across departments, and flagged a dozen details that now seemed obviously missing. But no one had reached out. No one would. That was part of the pattern. Keep the silence intact, pretend nothing had shifted. But outside, the shift was obvious. Another client, one known for requiring deep cultural nuance in its messaging, launched a product teaser during a national holiday that wasn't relevant to their market. The tone was off, the engagement plummeted. Internally, I imagined meetings filled with vague accountability and last minute revisions, because what else could they do? The people in the room weren't equipped. They weren't unintelligent, they were unprepared, because the preparation had never been about templates, it had been about trust. I began receiving messages, not from leadership, but from former colleagues. One asked, cautiously, if I'd seen the recent campaign. Another joked, "It's wild how much they've aged since you left." But beneath the humor, I could feel it, the recognition that something had been lost, that whatever ease or rhythm the team once had was gone now, replaced by a scramble to keep things looking intact. And still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already made my decision. I wasn't going back. I wasn't returning to fix what they refused to value. What they were experiencing now wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even karma. It was the result of a choice they had made, one rooted in assumption that my role was a set of tasks, that my contribution could be replicated through delegation. That presence was optional if the process looked clean on paper. But now the paper was curling at the edges, and everyone could see it. The third client was the one no one saw coming, a boutique tech firm with a notoriously high standard for detail and an unusually loyal relationship with the strategist they worked with, me. I had handled every campaign for them over the past 2.5 years. I knew their founder's tone, their investor timelines, their pet peeves. They were demanding, yes, but they were also deeply consistent. And the silence that followed their latest campaign launch wasn't just noticeable, it was telling. No public promotion, no reposts, no follow-up content. I kept watching quietly until one morning I noticed their profile no longer followed the agency account. The agency, in turn, stopped tagging them altogether. A small update on the agency's website removed their logo from the client success section. No announcement, no case study recap, just a quiet disappearance. That's when I knew. They had left, and they hadn't made a fuss about it, not publicly. Because people who know their worth don't need to argue, they just walk. What followed was predictable. The agency's leadership team began holding closed-door sessions. A reshuffling of internal staff was quietly announced under the guise of realignment. The 2 junior associates assigned to my former accounts were moved to support roles. A new head of client partnerships was introduced via an all-team email, a role that had never existed before. Internally, the narrative shifted. It wasn't about mistakes, it was about growth challenges, market shifts, client evolution. But those of us who had been in the trenches knew better. Clients don't leave because of market changes. They leave when trust is broken, when responsiveness disappears, when expertise is replaced by process. And what had happened wasn't a shift. It was a failure to see that people relationships drive brand longevity far more than polished decks or punctual delivery. They had built a machine to replace presence, but presence wasn't the thing breaking down now. It was the machine itself. From what I heard, executive conversations turned tense. One of the partners, once known for brushing off people issues as emotional noise, was now asking hard questions about why no one saw the exits coming. But the truth was, they had seen it. They just didn't believe it would cost them anything. Until now. And still, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Their silence was speaking loudly enough. And what it revealed, more than anything, was this. The absence they designed for me had finally arrived. For them. The first visible fracture didn't come from a headline or a public misstep. It came from inside. One of the agency's lead project managers submitted her resignation. She had been there longer than most, had weathered multiple leadership transitions, and was known for staying calm even in chaos. Her departure wasn't explosive. It was quiet, respectful, and immediate. But anyone who paid attention could feel the shift. Her exit meant something, and soon after, more followed. A content strategist left citing lack of clarity. A client coordinator left for a role better aligned with personal values. These were the phrases used in their exit interviews, but they didn't need explanation. People weren't running from work. They were running from a culture that had made certain kinds of silence normal. What had once been high functioning dysfunction was now just dysfunction. Visible, uncomfortable, and no longer sustainable. The agency attempted to stabilize. A new internal initiative was launched under the banner of Rebuilding Trust. There were listening sessions, anonymous surveys, and a half-day retreat focused on company values in a post-growth era. But none of these efforts addressed what everyone knew. The problem wasn't in the branding. It was in the choices leadership had made and refused to take accountability for. Meanwhile, the revenue gaps became harder to mask. The loss of 3 major clients in one quarter wasn't just inconvenient. It was destabilizing. Projects that had once been held up as examples of creative excellence were now quietly removed from the pitch deck. One partner was tasked with personally salvaging a strained client relationship, something that hadn't happened in years. Another started asking lower-level team members for direct feedback, an unprecedented shift in power dynamics. I watched from a distance, still connected loosely through former colleagues and the occasional LinkedIn update. No one had named me, no one would, but every action now being taken, every restructure, every apology, every sudden awareness of operational blind spots, pointed back to a single absence that no one could quite frame. They had built a system that assumed loyalty was optional, that trust could be reassigned, and that knowledge could be documented in a spreadsheet. But systems like that only function until they're tested, and this one had been tested by its own assumptions. And it was beginning to fall apart. The final unraveling didn't look like drama, it looked like disconnection. Slack channels that were once noisy with collaboration fell silent. Weekly wins became scarce, replaced by vague updates about internal realignments. Team leads no longer spoke with confidence, just caution. And the energy that once defined the agency, even at its most chaotic, gave way to a flat corporate exhaustion. The collapse wasn't explosive, it was ambient. A slow dimming of momentum that no rebrand could mask. The executive who once denied my maternity adjustment, citing workload stability as the justification, quietly stepped down. The internal email announcing her exit was brief, impersonal, and signed by someone she once mentored. Her replacement was brought in with a mandate to modernize our people-first strategy. I read that line 3 times. People first, a phrase that had been notably absent when I needed it most. HR rolled out a revised parental leave policy shortly after. It included phased reintegration, remote transition options, and dedicated support for returnees. The language sounded progressive, even generous, but for those who had been through the previous system, it didn't read as growth. It read as correction. A quiet admission, wrapped in corporate polish. I heard from former clients too. Some reached out indirectly, liking old posts of mine, commenting on unrelated updates, or forwarding job opportunities with a casual note like, "Thought of you." Others were more direct. One, who had left the agency abruptly, sent a message that simply read, "You were right. They never understood what they had." I didn't respond, not out of resentment, just peace, because I no longer needed to explain what had happened. The outcome had already said it for me. The agency hadn't imploded, it still existed, still pitched, still posted online. But the version I had once believed in, collaborative, creative, people-driven, no longer lived there, and no one inside could quite name what had changed. Only that something had. That something was trust. And once trust leaves a system, you can't just hire it back. You have to earn it, slowly, intentionally, and often too late. I had left with silence. And now the silence had spread, not as vengeance, but as reflection. A mirror they couldn't look away from. And in that mirror was the cost, not of losing a single employee, but of failing to see her. I never reapplied, never asked to return, not even when former teammates hinted that leadership was more open now or that things are changing. I didn't need them to change for me. I needed to move forward without looking back for permission. And when the offer came, from one of the clients who had quietly exited the agency, it wasn't transactional. It wasn't even framed as a job. It was an invitation to build something from the inside, this time with autonomy. They asked if I'd consider leading their internal strategy team, not just overseeing campaigns, but shaping how they thought about voice, positioning, long-term relevance. And more than that, they made it clear, this would be on my terms. Remote first, flexible hours. A structure that honored experience without demanding burnout. I accepted, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had no interest in rebuilding old structures. I wanted to build better ones. I stepped into the new role with clarity. There were no trust gaps to navigate. I had already earned it. The team moved quickly, not because I pushed them, but because I listened. The work wasn't easier, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I found something I'd forgotten I needed: the freedom to lead without apologizing for presence, for boundaries, for being both strategist and mother without compartmentalizing either. And as we built campaign after campaign, something strange began to happen. Other women in the industry reached out, not with dramatic stories, but with quiet resonance. They had heard what happened. Not from me, I had never spoken publicly, but from the absence I had left, from the shifts they noticed in how that agency operated, from the caution that now surrounded every conversation about maternity, flexibility, retention, and none of them were asking for advice. They were asking something far more important. How did you know it was time to walk away? And I told them what I had learned, slowly and painfully. You walk away not when they shut the door, but when they teach you that keeping it open costs you more than it's worth. The story didn't end with me reclaiming a title or outshining the place that once pushed me out. It ended with me becoming someone who no longer needed to be recognized by the system that failed her. My legacy wasn't tied to a single project or campaign or client win. It lived in the quiet structural shifts that followed. I saw job listings at the agency change tone. Phrases like remote optional, flexibility encouraged, return to work support. I saw former colleagues begin to question the things we had once accepted as fixed. And I saw other women speak up earlier, more firmly, because they had a reference point now. Not just of what could go wrong, but of what it looked like to walk away with clarity. I didn't take credit for that. I didn't need to, because real change doesn't need attribution. It needs momentum. And what I had left behind wasn't noise or scandal, it was a record of what happens when people are treated as disposable, of how quickly systems designed to protect convenience can unravel when one quiet departure reveals what was truly holding everything together. I never burned bridges, but I didn't build new ones for people who couldn't carry weight. I focused on the spaces that welcomed integrity without performance, where boundaries were not negotiated but respected, where voice wasn't earned through overwork but assumed as default. Years from now, no one may remember my name in that agency. New hires will walk in, unaware of the departures that shape their policies, but some part of the structure will still hold the imprint of what was lost, and why. And that's enough, because revenge was never the point, presence was. And in the end, I didn't need to return to prove my worth. I had simply built a world where it could no longer be questioned.